The date is March 31st, 1985. Madison Square Garden pulses with electricity as over 19,000 wrestling fans witness history in the making. WrestleMania unfolds before a captivated audience, broadcast to over 1 million homes across closed-circuit television, marking professional wrestling's triumphant emergence into mainstream consciousness. At the center of this cultural earthquake stands a 6'7" giant with bleached blonde hair, flexing his 24-inch pythons as the crowd erupts in thunderous applause. Hulk Hogan, the golden god of sports entertainment, has officially become wrestling's first global superstar. 5 years of careful cultivation led to this defining moment, transforming Terry Bollea from a regional attraction into the face that would define an entire generation's relationship with professional wrestling. Over the next 9 years, Hogan would headline 8 of the first 9 WrestleManias, his red and yellow persona becoming synonymous with American heroism and childhood dreams. He would transcend wrestling, appearing in movies, television shows, and countless magazine covers, single-handedly dragging what was once considered a regional carnival attraction into the living rooms of suburban America. Yet as Hogan basks in the adoration of millions, flexing those famous pythons and cupping his ear to amplify the crowd's devotion, a darker truth lurks beneath the spectacle. Every gesture, every catchphrase, every defining characteristic of the Hulk Hogan persona was carefully extracted from another man's playbook. The muscles, the mannerisms, even the very word brother that would become wrestling's most recognizable greeting. All of it belonged first to a forgotten pioneer whose own dreams were systematically dismantled to build Hogan's empire. In the wrestling business, they call it paying your dues. But what happens when someone else collects the check? 7 years before Hogan's WrestleMania triumph, professional wrestling existed in a vastly different landscape. The sport was fragmented into regional territories, each with its own champion, its own storylines, and its own local heroes. The Worldwide Wrestling Federation, controlled by the elder Vince McMahon, represented the Northeastern Corridor's premier promotion, centered around the hallowed halls of Madison Square Garden. This was an era of traditional heroes, men like Bruno Sammartino, whose ethnic working-class appeal resonated with New York's immigrant communities, or Bob Backlund, the clean-cut All-American college wrestler who embodied wholesome athletic competition. Into this world of predictable archetypes stepped Wayne Coleman, better known as Superstar Billy Graham, a man who would forever alter the trajectory of professional wrestling. Graham was not merely ahead of his time, he was from an entirely different universe than his contemporaries. While his peers maintained the soft, undefined physiques of 1950s strongmen, Graham possessed a bodybuilder's sculpture that seemed hewn from marble itself. His 6'4" frame carried 275 pounds of meticulously crafted muscle, the result of countless hours spent alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger at the original Gold's Gym in Venice Beach, California. The visual impact was staggering. Graham's physique represented a paradigm shift in how wrestlers could present themselves, transforming the ring from a venue for athletic competition into a stage for physical perfection. His training regimen, developed under the tutelage of the legendary Stu Hart in Calgary, combined legitimate wrestling technique with bodybuilding aesthetics, creating a hybrid approach that would influence generations of performers. Yet Graham's revolutionary impact extended far beyond his physical attributes. Where traditional wrestlers spoke in measured tones about honor and sportsmanship, Graham exploded across television screens with a persona that seemed to channel pure electricity. His promos crackled with religious fervor and street preacher intensity, peppered with catchphrases that would become wrestling vernacular. It was Graham who first brought the word brother into wrestling, using it not as casual slang, but as a term of spiritual kinship, reflecting his deep religious convictions. His massive arms, which he lovingly referred to as 24-inch pythons, became the gold standard for wrestling physique descriptions. The theatrical elements of Graham's character were equally groundbreaking. He would begin matches by tearing his shirt off in a display of primal aggression, then strike a double bicep pose that showcased his unprecedented musculature. When the crowd's reaction reached fever pitch, Graham would cup his hand to his ear, a gesture that seemed to physically pull the audience's energy toward himself. These weren't merely wrestling moves, they were carefully choreographed moments of performance art that blurred the line between athletic competition and entertainment spectacle. Perhaps most remarkably, Graham achieved all this while working as a heel, wrestling's term for the villain. In an era when audiences religiously supported good guys and booed bad guys, Graham somehow transcended these boundaries. Fans found themselves cheering for his magnificence despite his character's supposed villainy. This phenomenon was virtually unheard of in the 1970s wrestling landscape, where moral clarity was considered essential to maintaining audience engagement. Graham's popularity created an unprecedented opportunity. As he held the Worldwide Wrestling Federation Championship throughout 1977 and into 1978, the idea began forming in his mind of executing a heel-to-face turn, transforming from villain to hero while retaining the championship. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of losing the title and then changing character, Graham envisioned maintaining his championship reign while shifting his persona to match his organic popularity. This would have created wrestling's first true anti-hero champion, a character who embodied both strength and righteousness without sacrificing the edge that made him compelling. The pitch to Vince McMahon Sr. should have been irresistible. Graham had proven his box office appeal, and his unique character had already begun influencing wrestlers across different territories. However, McMahon Sr. remained wedded to traditional wrestling narratives. He preferred champions who embodied clear-cut heroism. Men like Bruno Sammartino, whose immigrant story resonated with working-class audiences, or Bob Backlund, whose amateur wrestling credentials provided legitimate athletic credibility. On February 20, 1978, Graham's championship reign ended when he dropped the title to Bob Backlund in a match that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The loss wasn't merely professional, it was deeply personal. Graham had envisioned his face turn as the launching pad for mainstream superstardom, the moment when his unique blend of physical perfection and charismatic performance would break wrestling's regional barriers and establish him as a national celebrity. He had invested everything in his character, his body, his creativity, his spiritual convictions, only to watch his dreams dissolve because they didn't fit traditional wrestling formulas. The disappointment triggered a downward spiral that would define the next phase of his life. Graham left the federation shortly after losing the title, descending into a period of heavy drug abuse throughout 1979 and 1980 that would ravage both his body and his spirit. At precisely the moment when Billy Graham hit rock bottom, a young wrestler named Terry Bollea was beginning his ascent in the very same promotion that had rejected Graham's vision. Bollea, wrestling under the name Hulk Hogan, had spent several years developing his character in various territories, but his time in the World Wrestling Federation marked a crucial evolution. Under Vince McMahon Sr.'s guidance, Hogan began incorporating elements that seemed strikingly familiar to anyone who had followed Graham's career. The transformation was methodical and comprehensive. Hogan's similarly styled bleached blonde hair echoed Graham's visual aesthetic. His muscular physique, while not quite matching Graham's bodybuilding perfection, represented a clear attempt to capture similar physical appeal. More tellingly, Hogan's verbal patterns began incorporating Graham's most distinctive elements. The word brother became central to Hogan's vocabulary, though stripped of Graham's spiritual context and transformed into casual camaraderie. Most remarkably, Hogan's pre-match routine seemed lifted directly from Graham's playbook. The shirt removal, the double bicep pose, the ear-cupping gesture, all of Graham's signature moments were seamlessly integrated into Hogan's performance. Even the 24-inch Python's description found its way into Hogan's promos, applied to arms that, while impressive, lacked Graham's bodybuilding precision. The crucial difference was positioning. Where Graham had been forced to work as a heel, despite his natural popularity, Hogan was eventually established as a babyface. This alignment allowed Hogan to fully capitalize on the character elements that Graham had pioneered, presenting them within the traditional good guy framework that McMahon Sr. preferred. In 1982, Billy Graham attempted a comeback, returning to what was now the World Wrestling Federation under Vince McMahon Jr.'s control. The contrast was heartbreaking. Years of drug abuse and physical neglect had transformed the once magnificent Graham into a shadow of his former self. His muscular frame had withered, his confident demeanor had been replaced by visible fragility, and his character had been completely reimagined. Gone was the superstar gimmick, and in its place stood a shaved-headed martial arts expert who bore no resemblance to the man who had once revolutionized wrestling presentation. The new character was a disaster. Audiences who remembered Graham's glory days were shocked by his deteriorated appearance, while newer fans had no connection to his legacy. After 8 months of struggling to recapture his former magic, Graham quietly left the company again, his comeback serving only to highlight how thoroughly his original concept had been appropriated by others. As WrestleMania 1 unfolded and Hogan cemented his status as wrestling's biggest star, Graham made one final attempt to reclaim his identity. Working for Jim Crockett Promotions in the mid-1980s, he briefly revived the superstar gimmick, complete with dyed mustache and goatee that gave him a more mature, distinguished appearance. This version of Graham generated little interest, but it did provide Hogan with one final element to steal: the facial hairstyling that would become part of his later Hollywood persona. The tragic irony of Graham's story becomes most apparent when examining the aftermath of this identity theft. As Hogan's career soared into the stratosphere, earning him millions of dollars and global recognition, Graham's life continued its downward trajectory. Health problems mounted, financial difficulties accumulated, and depression deepened as he watched his stolen persona generate wealth and fame that should have been his. The desperation reached its peak during the federal steroid trial that targeted Vince McMahon Jr. in the early 1990s. Graham, now broke and forgotten, sued his former employer, claiming that McMahon had pressured him to use steroids during his wrestling career. The lawsuit was subsequently undermined when evidence revealed that Graham had been using steroids for at least a decade before joining the federation, making his claims appear more like the desperate act of a man trying to extract compensation from a system that had discarded him. This represented the cruelest chapter in Graham's story. Here was a man who had revolutionized wrestling presentation, who had pioneered the physical and performance standards that would define the industry for decades, reduced to making questionable legal claims against the very promotion that had refused to recognize his vision. The same company that had rejected his face-turn concept had become wrestling's dominant force by implementing that exact strategy with his stolen persona. In the end, Hulk Hogan still undoubtedly deserves credit. He took the blueprint, the idea, and ran with it, transforming it into something even bigger, even more impactful than its original creator could have imagined. Every artist has heroes and mentors. Very few ideas are entirely original. Inspiration is a powerful force, and evolution is part of any creative endeavor. Yet a fundamental truth remains. It must also be acknowledged that Hogan did, in fact, steal this man's life, his innovative character, his signature mannerisms, and his catchphrases, and used them to become one of the most famous and successful figures in the history of professional wrestling. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that Hogan would eventually acknowledge this debt, but only after it was too late. Following Billy Graham's death in May 2023, Hogan publicly admitted that Graham shaped his legendary career and confessed, "I wanted to be like him." These words, spoken decades after Hogan had built his empire on Graham's foundation, ring hollow in the face of a man who spent his final years struggling with poverty and obscurity, while watching his creation make millions for another. For in the shadows of Hogan's global dominance, a quiet, uncredited voice had been echoing for decades. "I made you, brother.